Hello and welcome to this video, and on this video I'm going to be going through the 10 greatest music artists of the 20th century. I didn't expect to do this video today, and I will get into what's actually happened. Strange things happened to me this morning, and this is why I'm now doing this video. I was actually going to do a different video and strange circumstances have happened. But before we get into that, let's look at the criteria, what we're talking about. We're talking about the 10 greatest musicians of the 20th century. So the criteria you've got is greatness, and I think greatness points to a number of attributes, not one. I think we have to look at artists who have sold a reasonable amount of records, who have been very successful. We also have to look at their skill level. They have to have a musical skill which makes them great. They have to have innovated certain ideas that have influenced the music business, and perhaps reached further than just the music world out into the mainstream culture. If we think of all those things there and add them up, then we have a criteria that we can start to measure this by. Now, what happened this morning was I came in here and I was going to do a video on a certain artist. I won't mention them yet because they're in the list. And I went off on a mad tangent and I started to talk through my thought process about these artists. And I started to discuss, this idea of greatness, and a number of artists started to pop in my head, and I was live on camera, weighing these up. It was a great video, and I knew it was going really well. I didn't expect to do it, but suddenly I was in the middle of this, of pitting all these different artists as they flew into my mind. It was actually recording the very process of trying to come up with one of these ranking videos, and the process is more interesting than the actual list. So anyway, I'm in the middle of this, and my mentor, who's a guy called Kevin Gammond, he burst into the room. Now, I've tried to get Kevin on this channel, but he won't come on. But he came in the middle of a video, and I thought, oh my God, I've actually got him on video. And I was talking about a certain musician at that time, and he started to tell a story. Now, Kevin was the guitarist in a band called the Band of Joy, which was the precursor to Led Zeppelin. He was the guitarist, and on vocals they had Robert Plant, and on drums they had John Bonham. Before that, Kev had been the guitarist at a very young age with the West Indian musician that found fame in the UK, Jimmy Cliff, who was a very important artist. And he started to tell these stories, and what I realised was that the thing about greatness is not transmitted on a big level. Greatness happens with these little small interactions between certain people that might be doing a gig together, or they might jump in together, or somebody will say, check this album out. And I realized one of the things I was missing from my ranking videos is the idea of talking to you. I feel like I'm talking to a wide audience, but I'm actually talking to you. And when we discuss this, the concept of subjectivity emerges. And you could easily say, I don't think that artist is important. I think somebody else is. And the reason is because our lives are unique to us. And we have all these little moments that make us who we are. And you have to take that into account. And with that in mind, I thought, yes, and these artists are coming into my head. And I get to the end of the video, and I think I've arrived at who I think is the greatest music artist of the 20th century. And I felt actually recording the discussion was a truer, more objective way of doing it, because it is so subjective. Does that make sense? Anyway, so I finish up, I think, oh my God, that was great. And I turn around and the video hasn't recorded. I was a bit upset. So I went and got myself a cup of coffee, and I thought, right, this has happened to me. What am I going to do with this? So I came back and I wrote down the ranking that I'd come up with. So I have this ranking that has been created with a slightly different thing in mind, and has taken on board the idea of these small happenings. And I'm going to try and explain the small happenings and why it makes us rate stuff. Now, before we start, The reason why I think there's a worth to this type of video is because I believe art and music is incredibly important because it evaluates, in that it tries to quantify value. When we talk about music and art, we are talking about value, and value is both subjective and objective. And so as we go on this journey, what you must remember is that this list is my list. It's the way what's popped into my head. And if you agree with some of it, it's because there is a communal sense of value that goes between you and me. And I'm talking about you, not the audience. I'm talking about you. And if we step back, we can see how that works and operates. And we start to see the value of art and music. But also, there is a sense of objectivity because artists that have been able to do that, and you ask yourself, what is it that makes these things happen, these magical moments? So I'm going to start at number 10, and I'm going to explain the magical moment for each of these artists and why I think they made the list. So at number 10, I have put Run DMC stroke Rick Rubin. Now, this is really particular to right now. I'm a music YouTuber. And of course, I watch all the big music YouTubers. One of my favorite music YouTubers is Rick Beato. And Rick Beato interviewed Rick Rubin last night. I watched that interview. And that's what I'm talking about, the interaction. You have Rick Beato as a music producer and sort of jazz guitarist. He's produced a lot of rock music. But he's aware of Rick Rubin because of his production on certain rock bands like Red Hot Chili Peppers. But Rick Rubin was pulled from the rap scene in the 1980s. And when I watched it, it was interesting to see how rap went from being a sort of almost novelty form that nobody really understood or cared about. And at some certain point, it became something that the music industry was interested in, and Rick Rubin describes how in the mid-80s when he went to the record companies, they went, oh, it's great what you do, it's great all this production, but it's not really proper music. And I think this idea that rap and hip-hop is not proper music exists to this day. Chatting to my friend Kev, and he starts to tell his stories, and what was very apparent is in the early 60s in London, those bands that were playing were very much considered in the same way. A lot of those records were novelty records, and they caught on. And then if you go back to the beginnings of jazz blues, and we look at the original Dixieland Jazz Band, that wasn't recorded as a jazz record, it was recorded as a novelty record. There is a point always where novelty turns into art. And I think Run DMC are that group in terms of rap. If we are looking at 20th century music, we have to consider rap. And I have often wondered, where do you go? What's the artist that you would say? Is it African Bambaataa? Is it the Sugar Hill Gang? Is it Grandmaster Flash? And I think all those artists are important. But that moment when Run DMC decided to collaborate with Aerosmith, right, is the moment where rap and hip hop took its place in the pantheon of 20th century music. If that hadn't have happened, and in a way it had to happen, but if that hadn't have happened, it would have been a novelty music form in the early 80s. Rick Rubin is the genius that realized that this had to happen. And he went to who he considered were the Beatles of rap. That is how he described them. Run DMC in the 80s, I think they personified in their albums, in their music, a certain level of seriousness, a certain level of innovation that placed them in a certain place. Now, I think a big thing with the Beatles that jettisoned them to superstardom was when they went to the States. We will obviously be getting onto the Beatles because I've given the game away. They're on this list as well. I think Run DMC occupied that position in the mid-80s. What Rick Rubin realised that he had to show how this was actual music. And he said as soon as he had this idea, the first band he thought of was Aerosmith. Now, Aerosmith were a bit down on their luck at that point. I don't think Aerosmith or Run DMC or anybody wanted to do this collaboration. But what Rick Rubin had noticed is that Steven Tyler on Walk This Way was rapping. And he understood the history of music and the way music had wound through and the way the aspects that are in rap music go right back to the beginning of 20th century popular music. And the reason why Run DMC and Rick Rubin are so important, I think, in the history of 20th century music, because that's the point where those things are pulled together. Walk This Way does not compromise rap or hip hop in any shape or form. The beat that's on that groove is your classic hip hop beat. And the place that the vocals occupy in that is exactly the same place that rap occupies. And so when people heard that record, the mainstream audience were far more accepting of seeing this thing that was unknown to them placed in a place that they understood and knew. It brings two things together. And I think that moment, and then the fact that Run DMC and Rick Rubin did not give up. You then get the him setting up Def Jam Records, and he signs LL Cool J and Public Enemy, and Public Enemy come in, and they really turn, for me, rap into an art form. And some of you will agree with that, some of you won't. But I think the moment that where we have to pick one artist to personify this music form that has dominated the last 40 years of popular music and 20th century music, I think we have to give it to Run DMC. So that's the first one I got on my list, Run DMC / Rick Rubin. I've put them in together. At number 9, I have an artist that opened up the door for Run DMC in a way, and it is Michael Jackson. Now, I would never have put Michael Jackson on the list normally. If I was coming up with this, I would discount him. But when I was doing my talk this morning that did not save, one of the things that became apparent to me is that we have to consider popular music in this. It's at the forefront. And who exemplifies popular music in the 20th century? It's Michael Jackson. And why is that? And that is because Michael Jackson was brought up in a family where the Black American music was embedded in his approach. So Michael Jackson was more than just a great singer or a great songwriter. He was a performer, and he knew how to put on a show. This was so important to a lot of the music that was considered black music that lays the groundwork for rock and roll, rhythm and blues and all that type of thing. Throughout the 70s, the fact that he's a child, I think, takes away the danger that the white audience always felt with black music. You know, there's an argument that Elvis Presley can be seen as a sort of whiteifying of rhythm and blues. And this is to take nothing away from Elvis Presley. But also the artists that did break, that were black, were people like Little Richard. And Little Richard was quite effeminate. So there was a need to sort of take away the danger that was inherent in artists like Howlin' Wolf and Muddy Waters. And I think Michael Jackson seems to be like the personification of black American popular music by taking James Brown and Diana Ross. If you put those two things together. And so what we have in Michael Jackson is something very interesting in terms of what I think is a great popular music artist. And it's the combination of masculine and feminine. He seems to embody both. And he also embodies the idea of being childlike, which of course becomes very contentious knowing his fall from grace, because of course Michael Jackson reaches the highest heights, but now he's dead and he's prematurely dead. We see a fall, and that fall is so important, I think, in the idea of the 20th century pop star. Michael Jackson, in 1979, when he made Off the Wall, became the biggest black artist on the planet. And he became very aware that he could not cross over because his race was holding him back. The mainstream popular music forms would not accept that. You know, this is the point where MTV has emerged, and in MTV when they first started would not put black artists on the channel. It's quite incredible to think that only 40 years ago that was going on. The first black artist to go on the channel was Herbie Hancock, and that was because Rocket was an instrumental and he wasn't particularly featured in the video. So Michael Jackson is now faced with this problem. He brings in Quincy Jones, and Quincy Jones and Michael Jackson create this album Thriller, which takes black American pop music and it, in a way, smooths it out for the mainstream audience. This is partly done by bringing in people like Eddie Van Halen, who at that point in time were selling millions of albums, making rock music. But the musicians that are brought in, they actually take that idea of Van Halen and they pull it down and they simplify it. It also goes to Hollywood film. This happens so many times because Hollywood film is the precursor to rock and roll. And so many artists that are really important have some sort of grasp of that. And Michael Jackson has this when he does Thriller. Thriller combines all these things together. It combines electronic music, the new digital sampling technology. It takes like rock music, AOR, and combines it with rhythm and blues, soul, and does it fully. And it has a panoramic sort of cinema aspect that is utilised in these videos that turn this album into the biggest selling album of all time and make Michael Jackson at that point the biggest artist in the world, which he then consolidates. He consolidates it in Bad, he consolidates it with Dangerous, and all the albums that follow on. And so he really rules the 1980s in terms of world popular music, which is where popular music returns. The 1980s is the peak for popular music. It produces Prince and it produces Madonna and all these incredible artists. And I think what Michael Jackson brings to this is this sort of almost like transhumanist idea of what popular music is. Because not only does he represent the masculine and feminine, he now starts to represent black and white. And in fact, he makes a single, one of the biggest music videos ever made, which deals with that directly. He has a conceptual aspect to him, which I think places him in a completely unique place in terms of popular music history. Beyond Elvis Presley, beyond the Beatles, he is the ultimate pop star. And in that is his fall. You know, when we talk about Michael Jackson now, there is a whole thing around him to do with all sorts of things, which I don't want to even mention on this channel, but you know what they are. And that fall from grace, that bitter taste in the mouth, I think is essential to understanding the journey that popular music has gone through in the 20th century. And here we are now with P. Diddy, you know, who is an established billionaire black musician, has been able to reach out and create all these different business avenues. And now the whole thing is going to come down like a ton of bricks. And so I think Michael Jackson's importance is based upon personifying all of that. And that's why I put it at number 9. He's a very, very important artist. At number 8, I've put Billie Holiday. Now, another thing that occurred to me that I don't consider is the feminine in popular music. Most pop stars in this very male-dominated music form, many of the pop stars and the superstars are women. There is a female energy that I think, in terms of popular music, travels further than the masculine energy. And I think we've touched on this. And it could be because when popular music at its root was channeling what was quite a masculine form of music in the blues and soul and all these incredible artists, the feminization of it is very important. We see it in jazz with Miles Davis. We see it in many artists, male artists, but the female artists play a huge importance. And my gut reaction when I considered this is I thought, so I need to put Aretha Franklin. Now, Aretha Franklin is a combination of gospel singers, Mahalia Jackson, and she's also goes to the jazz singers. Jazz vocals are so important. And then I went straight back to Bessie Smith. And then I thought, no, it's not Bessie Smith. At number 8, I've got Billie Holiday. And the reason I've got Billie Holiday is because I think Billie brings in a fragility to the popular song. She's a virtuoso singer. She's completely in control of her phrasing, which is something she's got from Louis Armstrong. But she understands how the mic works. She understands that she can be fragile and up close, and she brings in a certain intimacy and awareness of her doom, awareness of her travel. This is something that is, the great pop artists are compelling, and they're compelling because when we watch them, we're fascinated by seeing the power of their performance combined with the fragility that is inherent within them. And I think Billie Holiday personifies this. Billie Holiday is responsible for what I think is the greatest song of the 20th century, which is Strange Fruit, which was recorded in 1939 and embodies so much of this history that underpins, Western popular music. So this is who I've got as number 8, is Billie Holiday. And I think there is 2 voices in terms of female popular music voices. There is the big, powerful Bessie Smith type voice, and there is this plaintive, quiet, little voice of Billie Holiday. And I think that is key. And we have seen that over and over again. And when you look at popular music, the voices seem to swing between the Bessie Smiths and the Billie Holidays. If you listen to someone like Billie Eilish now, and you listen to the way she's delivering it, it goes right back to Billie Holiday. Billie Holiday is very, very important. And I knew that if I was just to go on my normal male view of this list and not open myself up, we would have a bunch of men on this list, and it's very important. And I'm afraid Billie Holiday is the only one, and that's who I've got at number 8. At number 7, it became apparent that you do have to consider the blues in this. And the blues is a very interesting music form. It's actually relatively new. We see it as being very old, but in reality, the first blues recording was Mamie Smith in 1920. And so, there's people walking the earth, or probably sat in a chair at the moment, who are alive when the first blues recording came out. Its roots probably go back to earlier than that, 1900. But the blues is the great innovation of 20th century music in terms of changing songwriting and moving songwriting away from this idea of being like a show tune or a folk tune. There's something else. And what I think the blues brings to popular music is the sacred and the profane. It's this dialectic that runs through all these artists. So blues emerges in the 1920s. It's what we call urban blues. It's people like Bessie Smith, as I said, Leroy Carr. It's holding its hands with jazz. There's a rhythm section there. It grooves and all that type of stuff. The music industry then affects the blues, and record labels go looking for authentic blues in a way. They go looking for other types of music that are in that genre, and they discover people like Blind Lemon Jefferson and Charlie Patton. And these become locally successful. We then get Robert Johnson. And these artists are all discovered in the British blues boom, which really lays the foundation for rock music in the UK in the 1960s and in the US to some extent. The guy that I think personifies all of this, that has one foot in that sort of rural blues, the Delta blues of Robert Johnson, and has the other foot in the electric blues and provides that bridge between the two, is of course Muddy Waters. And Muddy Waters is really important, I think, going to this idea of these small little events having these huge effects that I talked about at the beginning of the video, in that in the late 50s, Chris Barber, who was a British musician interested in traditional American music forms, and he was part of the trad jazz scene in the UK that then begat people like Lonnie Donegan, which brought this skiffle movement in, laying the groundworks for bands like Led Zeppelin and Jeff Beck, Clapton, and the Beatles, of course. Decided to bring over Muddy Waters. Now, a lot of the British blues enthusiasts in the late 50s went to these gigs expecting to see something authentic, to see a guy that was really from that world with an acoustic guitar singing his blues songs. And Muddy Waters turned up with electric guitar. Now, this electric guitar was plugged into an amp on stage about this big. This wasn't Napalm Death, but I think the roots of all of that is in there. That slight amount of amplification and electrification. We thought other artists were doing as well. You know, a lot of the stuff on Sun Records and Chess Records, Howlin' Wolf, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, they're all doing it. But I think Muddy Waters' trip to the UK and the way he did it and the musicians who saw him on that tour and the effect that it had places him in a higher level. And a lot of those blues-based bands that then lay the groundwork for progressive rock, you know, blues rock, heavy metal, were aware of Muddy Waters. Led Zeppelin were quoting from Muddy Waters directly. So he has this great power, and he has staying power. He's there right up until the 1980s. He's a force of nature, and I would say that Muddy Waters is perhaps the most important blues artist of the 20th century, which is why he gets on my list at number 7. Another music form that dominated 20th century music is the music form that we call soul. Now, I think soul does not get discussed enough. Soul is the music that creates Stax, creates Motown. It's the music that creates Otis Redding. It's the music that creates, you know, Dinah Ross and the Supremes, and then creates like James Brown, Sly and the Family Stones, George Clinton, Earth, Wind and Fire, disco, hip hop, funk, everything that we can think of has its roots in soul. And there's a whole number of people that are so important in the development of soul. But let's ask ourselves what soul is. Soul is the embodiment of the spirit in music. That is what a soul means. A soul is this spirit. It's this thing that's in there that is spiritual. And in the black music tradition in the 20th century, we see that in gospel music. A lot of artists were coming up in the 1940s within the gospel scene, and then they were transforming into the commercial world. And the musician I have at number 6 is Ray Charles. Now, Ray Charles started off with a piano trio where he was singing in the style of Nat King Cole. So he was aping the jazz form that was popular at the time. In 1954, he goes into the studio, and again, this is one of these moments that we have. And he starts to think, well, there's this music that comes from the church, but if I was to put more profane lyrics, you would have that church sound, the spiritual, and you would have at the same time this song that's visceral. And he records a song called I Got a Woman. Now, I Got a Woman lyrically is basically Ray Charles telling you about a woman he's got on the other side of town that he likes to go over and have sex with. That is the limit of that song. But anyone at the time who knew the world of gospel music will have known he'd have pulled directly from that world. And at that point, the idea of soul happens. I think Ike Turner is another musician that's very important in this, and it's laying the groundwork for rock and roll. But if you listen to soul music in the 1950s, it's almost like a head of rock and roll. And all the way through his career, Ray Charles keeps hitting over and over again. We then get the funk of What I Say, you know, we get the his take on country music. All the way through, he is innovating and resetting what soul music is. I think Ray Charles is the great genius of soul music, which is why I've got him at number 6. At number 5 is another musician that I wouldn't have put on the list. But as I was talking my way through, I thought we have to have rock music on there. And rock music's a specific thing. We're not talking about British beat groups like the Kinks or the Beatles. We're talking about rock music. And rock music is about heaviness. It's something that's embodied in Muddy Waters. It's about danger. And I instantly thought, well, that's Black Sabbath. Maybe Black Sabbath should go on my list. Or maybe Led Zeppelin. And as I was talking about this is when this weird thing happened. My mate Kevin walks in, and in the middle of the video, which I wish it had stored this, but in a way, what you're seeing is the summation of the process that's happened this morning. Kev pokes his head around the door and he goes, right, Andy, what are you doing? And I said, I'm talking about the greatest artists of all time. I didn't mean to, but I am. And he went, who are you talking about? He went, Jimi Hendrix. And he said, tell them about 1966 when Kev was playing with Jimmy Cliff, as I said earlier. And he said, I was backstage and Jimi Hendrix was there. And he said, we've been jamming on guitars. And he brings in this little record player with batteries in. And he says, Kev, you have to see this. And he plays, Kevin, Don Covey, right? And in that moment, Kev understood something, and he took that, along with a lot of other stuff that was happening at the time, and he took that into the Band of Joy. And if you listen to the early Band of Joy recordings, you could see there's a certain aspect that's in Led Zeppelin. And Led Zeppelin are almost a summation of this process. I've always argued that Cream are the important band for laying the groundworks for rock music, heavy metal, progressive rock, jazz, fusion. It's all there in Cream. But Hendrix comes in literally a few months later. And what Hendrix does is he becomes, in my opinion, the greatest rock musician that's ever lived. A virtuoso musician that could take the blues and take it to a psychedelic place, which only people like John Coltrane have explored. A brilliant songwriter with these trippy, surreal lyrics, an incredible performer. Jimi Hendrix is very, very important. And the only reason he's low on this list, I think, is because his period of creativity is about 3 years. When Kev met him, it was in 1966. He hadn't yet recorded his first single, Hey Joe. Hey Joe was a good choice because this is a folk song that goes back into the history of music. And what Hendrix was the real deal. He arrives in London, which is being fermented by people like Jeff Beck and Eric Clapton, and they're going back to this American blues form, but Hendrix is the real deal. And Hendrix has to go to London to pull all this stuff together. And he blows everybody away with this approach. And the idea that what was actually going on in London was these little meetings of Kev chatting with Jimi Hendrix and him playing records and him seeing what Hendrix is doing and seeing where it comes from and then exploring the records he's playing and then hit that going back in and influencing bands that then grow into these huge monoliths that we talk about endlessly on these videos. But these things are based upon tiny little events like that. And Hendrix, in terms of a creative period, is also a tiny period. When Kev met him, he hadn't recorded Hey Joe. As I said, he goes and records Hey Joe. The second track he records is Stone Free. If you go listen to Stone Free, 1966, that is beyond Cream, it's beyond the Beatles, it's beyond everybody on the planet of that time. Stone Free is an incredible record that still sounds fresh today. It's mind-blowing. Hendrix is the greatest rock musician and he personifies everything and he does it all in 3 years. It's an incredible achievement. Ray Charles emerged in the 1940s in the throe of Nat King Cole and his trio. Nat King Cole was going to go on to be a sort of middle-of-the-road singer-songwriter, albeit a brilliant one. But he was also a virtuoso pianist, and he had this smooth sound with his trio in the 1940s. And Ray Charles wanted to sound like that. But when he signed his record deal, there was a need and a want from the record labels to come up with something new. It's not like today. He wanted to come up with something else. And he looked at his background, his cultural background, and he saw the profane. This is going to be a theme that runs through it. Another artist that has done this. He saw the profane in the rhythm and blues that his family probably told him not to listen to because it was the devil's music. You know, the rock and rollers like Jerry Lee Lewis and Elvis Presley, they were tortured by the idea that they were playing devil's music. Take this rhythm and blues, right? But you look at the church music, the gospel that's grown out of the sort of Pentecostal tradition in America. And one day, before rock and roll's even become a popular thing, Ray Charles walks into the studio and he records a tune called I Got a Woman. Now, anybody who understands what gospel music is, and they hear that, I got a woman, way over down. It's good for me. Anyone knows that that is a gospel tune. But he has replaced God with sex in the same way as Bessie Smith did. All right? And he says, I've got a woman that's over town that's good for me. And in doing that to that beat and bringing those two things together, this is the beginning of soul. All right? And soul is an incredible word because I think 20th century popular music, the thing it has that it didn't have before, and I think it doesn't have now, is soul. There is a spirit inside it, a spirit that lives on. The last four were this came to me, and this is where I thought, I think I've nailed it here. This last four, I actually argued on this video. So I've got it down in front of me. So at number 4, I have Kraftwerk. Now, Kraftwerk upsets the viewers of this channel, and I'm going to explain firstly why I think they're so influential, and then secondly why I think it upsets people. Kraftwerk were a different deal to everything that had gone on in rock music before. They come out of an experimental, almost influenced by modern electronic and classical music in Europe. It's a certain aesthetic. They come out of the European progressive rock scene. At that point, a lot of artists in Europe and the UK were questioning how European artists could deal with the legacy of American rock and roll. And so Kraftwerk start to look at it, and I think the great achievement of Kraftwerk, which is beyond being the first to base song on drum machines, on repetition, on synthesizers, their great achievement in terms of music is their influence from sort of postmodernism. And what they do is they look at what has been established by rock and roll, and before that by the Hollywood film industry. And this is the idea of the artist who exists like a Superman or a Superwoman. It's Elvis Presley standing there, better looking than anybody, being able to dance and sing. And the whole industry is focused on them. And everybody who is looking at that, they look up to them from their position of being a cog in the machine. Everyone's just going to work, they're doing their job. And the 1960s has seen a reaction against that, and everybody wanted to sort of self-actualize in like a Nietzschean sense, and they wanted to be Jim Morrison, or they wanted to be John Lennon, you know, wild-eyed loner on the gates of hell. It's the whole mythology of rock music. Kraftwerk react against that. They become faceless. They become mundane. They create music about being a cog in the machine, and they do not even critique that. They don't turn around and go, isn't capitalism terrible? They just create songs about driving endlessly on a motorway or an autobahn, or being on a train and watching stuff go by. And it's 4 guys all looking like dummies, performing with no charisma whatsoever, and that their performance is almost like performance art taken from people like Gilbert and George. It's a whole new way of delivering popular music. Now, it should have stayed as some esoteric, weird European progressive rock band, but it gets picked up by rap musicians and dance musicians. And by the 1980s, Kraftwerk has become the most important most influential music artist of the last 50 years. And that, I know, this audience that watch this channel find that difficult to stomach. Now, the reason is, I think, is because Kraftwerk were never popular in America. There could be people watching this to go, Andy's got this in number 4. I have never heard of them, and I've never heard of any music by them. And when I mentioned Kraftwerk before as being, and I made the statement that they were more influential than the Beatles, and people found that really difficult to stomach. And I want to address this now. The reason why I said that was, it wasn't my thought. I've got no mind. I'm exploring this all the time because this is my business, is to come on here and do these types of videos. So I go online and I'm looking at Kraftwerk, and I come across an article that says, this band is more influential than the Beatles. And I thought, that's not true. I had that gut reaction that probably some of you have. And I read the article and I went, yeah, it did really. You know, Kraftwerk in 1974 made records that sound like they were made now. You know, you could sample them and put a auto-tuned vocal over the top. And as although many watch this channel will go, well, they might be really influential, but they influence crap. Most artists who are influential, that's what they do. It's whether you like that crap or not. Then I saw article after article stating this. But when I first said this, I got pushed back on the channel. And one person said, why didn't you choose Depeche Mode? Depeche Mode were far more successful, and they really pioneered in the early 80s some incredible electronic music, which they did. And so I thought, that's interesting. And so I Googled Depeche Mode, which I've listened to for the last 40 years. I know them pretty well. And, you know, I think I went onto Wikipedia, and there was their lead singer. What's his name? Dave Garr, is it? Can't remember. And he's there saying, we were totally influenced by Kraftwerk. There would be no Depeche Mode without Kraftwerk. I read interviews with African Bambaataa who've really laid the groundworks for rap and hip hop, say exactly the same thing. Giorgio Moroder, disco, house music, avant-garde electronic music and electronica, hip hop and rap all have this huge legacy to this band Kraftwerk, which is why I put them at number 4 in attempt to try and cover some of the newer music forms that have existed in the last 40 years. At number 3, I have Bob Dylan. Now, for many years, I said that Bob Dylan was the most important artist in rock music, and I think that's the case, but he's actually down at number 3. But Bob Dylan's importance is incredible. Bob Dylan emerges just after rock and roll has emerged. Everybody's listening to Little Richard and they're all listening to Jerry Lee Lewis. But that is sort of collapsing and it's moving into a sort of more accessible. The industry's got hold of it. And suddenly you've got doo-wop and all these songs and you've got like, you know, white artists coming in and taking all the juice and visceral energy out of this form of music. It's dying at that point. But Bob Dylan's not interested in that. He's interested in American folk forms, especially the music of Woody Guthrie. He puts out his first album, which should have just sunk without a trace. It was just some, you know, white kid making a folk album and recording a whole bunch of songs that a load of other people were interested in and recording at that time. But on his second album, he decides to, and it's a stroke of genius, he looks at what's going on in Woody Guthrie's music and he realised that he can sing within this folk form style music. He can sing about subjects that relate to him. He only needs 3 chords and he only needs that style of singing which does not focus on the beauty of his vocal. He's not trying to be Frank Sinatra. He is trying to put the lyrics first, and that album is groundbreaking, but he doesn't stop there. He then takes that form, he electrifies it, and by 1965, with his recording of Like a Rolling Stone, this completely changes what was a novelty music, a popular music form, a form of music that you put on when you were driving around in your car chasing women or chasing men, whichever one you wanted to do, and going out and having a drink and having fun. You know, that whole sort of American graffiti view of rock and roll is changed by Dylan. And Dylan is not your archetypal pop star. He's not Elvis Presley. He hasn't got the voice of a Frank Sinatra. And his music is relatively simple to play. And at that point, he democratizes it. And now people feel that they can join in. It's almost about this visceral thing that's contained within the blues and it's contained within punk rock. It's that permission to get involved. And every musician from the Beatles to Frank Zappa to Joni Mitchell are all greatly influenced by Bob Dylan. He makes rock and roll serious, and that opens the door for rock music. So that's who I've got at number 3. At number 2, above Bob Dylan, we have the Beatles. Now, the reason why the Beatles are there is because, if we mention Bob Dylan may have not made the move to be an electric folk if he hadn't heard the Beatles. He met the Beatles around about 64 in the States, and they both cross-pollinized at that moment. And it has been said that the album Help, which opens up with that slash chord at the beginning, bang, and that electric guitar sound, that influenced the American folk scene and opened up this idea for this jangly sort of 12-string guitar music that we hear with the Byrds. So the Beatles play a part even in that. But if we step back, what the Beatles are is the most popular, most creative, most successful band in history. This is the biggest band in the world, and they're so important that they inform culture. And I think if the Beatles hadn't happened, you wouldn't have had that mainstream kick that makes rock music become the dominant art form. It's more important than the cinema and Hollywood. It's more important than television. A whole generation are completely changed. I have met jazz fusion musicians who were changed by listening to the Beatles and what they were instrumentally doing. Songwriters were changed by the Beatles. Music production was changed by the Beatles. Haircuts, clothes. And I think what's so important with the Beatles is their move in the 60s to making films. Because when rock and roll came in, it was a novelty form. The mainstream art form at the time was cinema. That was the thing everybody went to see. But by the 1960s, television is taking over from that. If we look at Elvis Presley, he's almost made impotent by the Hollywood film industry. He's a dangerous character, you know, a person that they would not film below the waist when he went on television. And then suddenly Hollywood gets in and he makes a string of films. He gets taken away from that visceral creative music form, and he is weakened incredibly until in 1969 he puts on the leather jacket and comes back with his comeback shows and shows everybody who he was. Hollywood did not do Elvis any favours. But with the Beatles, their first film, A Hard Day's Night, is one of the greatest films ever made cinematically, right? In the 1950s, the French New Wave films like Francois Truffaut, Jean-Luc Godard was influencing all of film. You know, if we look at the sort of Martin Scorsese's and George Lucas's and Steven Spielberg's, they're all coming out of this re-energization that came from French New Wave. And we see that in the UK, and we see the rise of these sort of kitchen sinks films like The Loneliness and Long Distance Runner, Saturday Night, Sunday Morning. These films emerge, and A Hard Day's Night is filmed in that style. It's an incredible black and white cinema verite film, and it just follows them, a day in the life of the Beatles, and they produce a soundtrack, and that album is released as a soundtrack. And in being a film soundtrack, it has a wider emotional range, and it has a conceptualization because it's the album that goes with the film, and it's promoted by this film. And I think that is so important to establish the Beatles as a cultural force. Right now, I think when we look at bands now, there's far more bands that have been influenced by Black Sabbath or Kraftwerk than there are influenced by the Beatles. But taking my metric right from the start of this video, they tick all the boxes, except they are not virtuoso musicians in the way Jimi Hendrix is. And I think that's part of their charm. I think the Beatles were good musicians, they were a tight band, but I think they also inspired people to form bands. And I think if we add it all up, and it's come on this channel so many times when I'm exploring the importance of certain artists, the Beatles come up over and over again. So I have now put the Beatles at number 2. At number 1, I have the guy that I always put there. And my video this morning was going to be a discussion on Louis Armstrong and his importance in 20th century music. Because I already placed him at number 1, and I went off on this big tangent and came up with this list, which is what you're watching now. Louis Armstrong, I've spoken about this so many times. Louis Armstrong was born in 1901 in New Orleans. He's part of the music scene that creates all of 20th century popular music, which is jazz. And at that point, jazz is not jazz. Jazz is also blues. It's also marching music. It's dance music. It's everything. His contemporaries were people like Freddie Keppard, Jelly Roll Morton, King Oliver. They're his contemporaries. He's part of that New Orleans scene, which is a mystery to us. When jazz musicians start getting recorded in the 1920s, Louis Armstrong is such a virtuoso on his instruments, and he has something to say which goes beyond the confines of jazz at that point. And as soon as he's recorded, he understands how recordings work, and he starts to organise the recordings. He starts to arrange the music. He starts to bring certain soloists forward and back. He creates drama in taking the instruments out and putting it back in. And within that, he then improvises in a way that takes a wider vocabulary of sound that has ever been heard before, because recording allows you to do this. He uses slurs, he uses different types of vibrato, the great long notes, short staccato notes. Sometimes he'll play like a fanfare. Sometimes he'll play sort of chromatic, weird, almost like speech patterns. Sometimes it'll be abstract noise, or we're doing an impersonation of a train or a siren or a car going past. And he molds all that into these recordings, which have a drama which nobody has heard before. He consolidates the rhythm section, and the way he arranges music becomes the blueprint for the Chicago style. And the Chicago style then begats the big band swing era in the 1930s, which brings in the rhythm section, groove, and popular stars like Frank Sinatra and Bing Crosby. All of that comes from Louis Armstrong. But Louis Armstrong's got another string to his bow. We haven't finished. He's also a singer, and his singing revolutionises popular music. Louis Armstrong is not your average beautiful voice singer. He has not got a voice like a Caruso or even like an Al Jolson. He's got this gravelly voice, but he knows how to use it. When I mentioned Billie Holiday, what Billie Holiday brings to popular music and jazz comes from Louis Armstrong. He redefines the commercial music vocal, and the way he redefines it is by putting a stamp on it. We know Louis Armstrong is singing because his voice is so individual. And he takes all that vocabulary that I've just described and he puts that into popular music. He also puts that into his voice. Okay, so this is really, really important. Now, there's two other factors here that featured. I talked about this with the Beatles. One is changing culture, and one is sort of popularity. Now, popularity, Louis Armstrong occupies a space in music no one else does. As I said, this is a guy that was born as right at the bottom of the pile in New Orleans. He was put into the waifs' home for shooting a gun off on New Year's Eve, and somebody handed him a cornet, and the world never was the same again. But he travelled all the way through. And when he died in 1971, he was still having pop hits. Nobody has had a travel like that in music. The other night, I decided to watch the last James Bond, which I think is called To Die Another Day. I think that's it. And I didn't want to watch it because James Bond gets killed. And there's this huge franchise. It's been there since I was, first awake to films. I can remember as a kid when they first showed Dr. No on the television. It's a big event. I'm a massive James Bond fan. So I didn't want to watch it. But this franchise is huge. It's absolutely huge. And one of the key things about James Bond is the fact that these great artists have come in and sung the song. It's a big thing, whether it's Shirley Bassey or Matt Monro or Paul McCartney or Chris Cornell or Billie Eilish or Adele or Duran Duran or whoever it is, Dionne Warwick, whoever it is that they've got in. It's been the gamut of the greatest popular musicians of all time. And as this franchise draws to a close and James Bond is dead and they want to wrap this up, what do they go for? Louis Armstrong singing one of the greatest pop songs of all time. We've got all the time in the world. And it choked me up. It choked me up. Louis Armstrong could sell a record right now with his voice. He's that important. Now, culturally, not only did his music reach that far and also into films like Hello, Dolly and all that, throughout the 40s and the 50s, Louis Armstrong was a film star. He occupied that space. And as I do this, I realise how important that is in terms of 20th century music, this transition from the Hollywood sort of studio system, and that being the mainstream art form, the new art form of the 1920s and 1930s, to rock and roll being the most important art form in the 1960s and the 1970s. Louis Armstrong travels across the whole lot of that. He is unique. Every musician, every singer, every musical arrangement, every approach to the popular song, every technical aspect. And you've got to remember in the 1920s, he was also pioneering voiceovers, novelty stuff, telling stories, using the recording studio in a way nobody had used it before because he was the first to do it, you know, and with things like Heebie Jeebies, laying the groundworks for rap with his scatting. And this guy is the guy, and it doesn't shift. So although there's new people on this list for me, Louis Armstrong still wins out. He is still the most important artist of the 21st century. I would say that objectively. If you came to this wondering who it would be, it's still Louis Armstrong. I will come back to this once a year and see who else gets on the list. And that's coming from my own unique experiences. You know, as I said, if I hadn't watched that Rick Rubin interview, I don't think Run DMC would have made number 10, but they're on the list now. Anyway, that's the end of this video. If you enjoyed this video, please put a like on it. And if you want to see more, please subscribe. If you want to support me, I have a Patreon. On that Patreon, you can become a free member, and there's content for the free members. And then there's more content for the paid members. And if you're a paid member, you get access to the Andy Edwards WhatsApp group, which is full of like-minded musicians and music listeners. And it's an incredible place, which has taken on a life of its own. I have also set up a shop on my Patreon. Go and have a toddle along. There's a whole bunch of stuff for you to purchase there, including my 3-hour epic, which is my A Hard Day's Night, where I go through the 20 greatest prog bands with a whole bunch of guests and surrealness. That is my masterpiece. It's over there now. You can't watch it on this channel anymore. And if you want to support me in another way, I have a PayPal tip jar. You can put some money in down below, which will help me to keep on doing this content. And if you look around this lovely studio I'm in, which has the potential for me to do all sorts of things, then you can support the charity that's put me in here and supported me, which is called the Jellyman's Heritage Arts Charity, and there's a link down below. I have got to the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope I came up with something that was interesting, compelling, and I hope I now have a pretty decent list of the 10 greatest music artists of all time. And I hope I made no mistakes, because I was trying to remember a lot of the stuff that I went through earlier, and I think that video this morning it's gone into the ether. It no longer exists. It never existed. And what you're watching here is the product of that. And I think it's helped me to come up with what I feel is a very strong list. I'm done. Thanks for watching.